Can you hear me okay back there?
Perfect.
It's a great honor to be introducing my dear friend Sarah Kafatou. I've known Sarah for a long time, known her as a terrific poet, translator, painter, musician. She's translated Dante, Pushkin, and a number of other texts, including Sophocles. I think you did the last one, the Colonus, right?
I did all three.
Oh, you did all three. That's incredible. I'm going to start off my introduction with a quote from Hilde Domin. I set foot on the air and it held, end quote, writes Hilde Domin. And in the space of the line break, we hear the held, precarious breath of a refugee who has learned to walk on the utter clarity of her sure-footed art. Domin's level voice has the philosophical seriousness and the political savvy and the lightness of touch of the great Polish poets such as Zagajewski, Herbert, and Szymborska. As with them, there's no posturing or pretension, but plenty of metaphysical and historical alchemy. Her characteristically slender stanzas are lyric vials of profound distillation. No matter how deep or unshakable her sorrow, there are songs for departure and songs of encouragement. They tell us, quote, not to tire, but to hold out your hand gently as if to a bird, to the miracle. I love Sarah Kafatou's four uses of to, that little functional word particle, in this exquisitely delicate lyric. None of the twos are stressed, but each of them is taking us to the miracle, which is the line inventing itself as it gets to where it was going to. Not to tire, but to hold out your hand gently as if to a bird, to the miracle. For me, the magic in Domin is the way that she hovers over the line in both the hand, as both the hand and the bird, keeping the width of the perception without generalizing, and the intensity of the focus without particularizing. Like Paul Celan and Nellie Sachs, Domin never loses sight of the dead, but her delicacy of perception is the register of tenderness itself, as when the child in Charon's boat that ferries the dead souls to the underworld, as when the child in Charon's boat is recognizable by, quote, the ever familiar slight turn of the head, end quote. Sarah Kafatou's translations are pitch perfectly in tune with these sublime poems of melodious eloquence and immense discretion. Sarah.
Thank you, George. I'm very moved. Who could do it? Who could throw the world high up for the wind to blow through? Heart, a snail with a house, draws in its horns. Hedgehog, heart. Heart, an owl in daylight, batting its eyes. Migrant bird, climate changer, heart. Heart, a ball struck, rolling a half inch. Sand grain, heart. heart, the great thrower of all balls. This is a poem from 1966, 20 years after the war. Gray times. It must be surpassed as belonging to the gray times. People like us, we among them, voyaged on ships this way and that, and could not land anywhere. People like us, we among them, were not allowed to stay and could not go. People like us, we among them, did not greet our friends and were not greeted. People like us, we among them, stood on foreign coasts asking for forgiveness that we existed. People like us, we among them, were saved. People like us, we among them. People like you among them. Each one can be expelled and stripped naked, naked human dolls, more naked than the bodies of animals beneath the clothes, body of prey, stripped, that in the morning were still clothed, white bodies. The lucky ones were merely driven from pole to pole. The gray times. I'm speaking of the gray times when I was younger than you are now. The gray times from which we are separated by 20 years only. The headlines in the newspapers, red and black, under the word Deutsch. I have already seen it, 20 years. Monday, much. Tuesday, nothing between us and the gray times. Often I see you ripped apart by wild beasts, by human beasts. We're laughing maybe. Your fear that I never saw, that fear, I see you. You, and that person, and that one. People like you among them. People like us, we among them. Naked human dolls today, still with clothes on. The headlines in the papers, red and black, under the word Deutsch. The dead are standing near the kiosks and looking wide-eyed at the headlines in the newspapers, black and red printed hate under the word Deutsch. The dead are afraid. This is a country where the dead are afraid. Don't call. Put your finger to your lips. Do not call out. Stand still beside the path. Maybe you should lie down in the dust. Then you can gaze into the sky and become one with the road. And whoever looks back at you can walk on, as though leaving no one behind. The walking away is easier when you're lying down than when you're standing up, when you're silent than when you call out. Watch the clouds pass. Be humble, hold tight to nothing. They dissipate. You too are very light. You too will not endure. There's no point in feeling fear of abandonment when the wind is already rising to drive the clouds away. I assumed when I translated this that it was a political poem about political persecution. No, it was a love poem about a lover's estrangement. Hilde always felt her personal life and her public life together and gave them to each other. But I think this is clearly a political poem. Prepared. Autumn is coming. We should lead lions on a leash. No one will come too close to us if we have the right pet, taller than a man when it stands on its hind legs. The one who bites the dog back. The one who steps on the snake's head. The one who holds the caiman's eye shut. That one is well prepared. More beautiful. The poetry of happiness is more beautiful. As a blossom is more beautiful than the stem that thrusts it up, so are the poems of happiness more beautiful. As a bird is more beautiful than the egg that is beautiful with light shining on it, so is happiness more beautiful. And the poems are more beautiful that I will not write. Hilde kept a small wooden dove on a wire in her bedroom as though flying over her bed. She planned to be buried with it. Promise to a dove. Dove. I was looking for a table when I found you. Dove, lying on your back, pink feet pressed to your white body, fallen out of the light, messenger in a jumble shop. Dove, when my house is burnt, when I'm cast out again, when I lose everything, I will take you with me, worm-eaten wooden dove, because of the gentle sweep of your one unbroken wing. James, in his very friendly way, has asked Mark and me to read a poem or two of our own, as well as those that we've translated, and so we have both committed to do that. And Hilde and I were friends, and so I thought I would write a poem that was addressed to a friend, but a different person, a scientist friend of mine in the Midwest. I actually wrote this in the form of a letter and sent it. Summer letter. I'm sitting here in sandals, watching the light as it catches and scatters in the grape arbor, making changing pictures on the pavement. An hour ago, I lay down and my sleep was one sky, cloudless, blue, depth on depth, as though we all had suddenly, effortlessly become what we forgot sometime in childhood. The wind blows, and I think it's God calling after me, telling me I'm good. If you were in your lab, weighing and teasing apart the stuff of nature and watching it recombine, a cagey puzzle that slips and locks in place only to separate again when it seems most fast. May you be given X-ray vision to pierce that glue, see clearly as Milton saw in his mind's eye the angels stepping freely in and out of one another in paradise. Or if you're looking out of your window at a billboarded highway advertising nothing, may your wide river rise from its tributaries and sweep those billboards like a logjam down the current into a better and saner future without them. Maybe the world needs us the way we need each other. Who else is there to wish it well or ill? Today, thinking of you, I wish it well with all my heart. This earth, our only home, our household, dilapidated, but still sheltering, now letting in sunlight through its sky window, later shining through the roof with all its stars. Back to Hilde. Salvanos. This is a poem that refers to the book of Daniel, the Old Testament. Save us. Today we call out. Today we name. A voice that speaks one word. What happened? With a little air that rises in us. With nothing but our breath, joining vowels and consonants in one word, one name. Taming the untamable, forcing it for as long as a heartbeat to belong to us. This is our freedom, speaking the right names fearlessly in a low voice, calling to each other in a low voice, calling the devourer by name with nothing but our breath. Salvanos, save us, ex ore leonis, from the jaws of the lion, holding open the jaws between which it is not our choice to live. What kind of sign shall I make over the door to be permitted to stay? The year races past. The air is dense with pollen. One grapevine means autumn. We have passed the test, built the house. We can go. Everywhere we strew flowers on the water for the dead who do not rest in the earth. Songs of encouragement. 3 parts. 1. Our pillows are moist with the tears of troubled dreams. Yet, once again, from our empty, helpless hands, a dove ascends. 2. You were long pursued around the doorless walls of the city. You flee, scattering the confused names of things behind you. Trust. This most difficult ABC. I make a small sign in the air, invisible, where the new city begins. Jerusalem, the golden. Out of nothing. 3. These birds with no pain, these lightest golden birds drifting, gliding over the rooftops. None of them inquiring about another. Not pleading, not yearning, only mingling, separating. We under the roofs, holding tight to each other. Look, the sun comes back again as golden smoke. What was falling rises, rises from Job's rooftops. The sun is rising today for a second time. A cry is a bird with no feet, no branch, no hand, no nest. A bird that flies itself raw in narrow passages. A bird that gets lost in open spaces. A bird that drowns in the sea. A bird that is a stone that cries. a mute bird that no one hears. Shelter. In the morning, in the white shelter of a bathtub without water, I think of the hollow tree trunk where I would wish to lie. Smooth, light-filled, with no edges, and me at home there like a dryad. No one will want to bury me in a tree trunk or a bathtub, in a cemetery that I've chosen because it receives the evening sun, but whose parish is one where I, the departed, the never registered in any church, in any city, the one whose letters are forwarded from country to country, do not belong. Yet, only a rose to lean on. I build myself a room in air among the acrobats and birds. My bed on a trapeze of feeling, like a bird's nest in the wind on the outermost tip of a branch. I buy a blanket of softest wool, of tenderly shorn sheep that wander in moonlight like shimmering clouds on the solid earth. I close my eyes and huddle in fleece of trustworthy animals. I want to feel the sand under my small hooves and hear the click of the lock closing the stall door at evening. But I lie in feathers, rocked high in emptiness. My head spins. I can't sleep. My hand gropes for support and finds only a rose to lean on. Everybody needs somebody to lean on, and I'm going to read a poem of mine also addressed to a friend, a different friend, after a quarrel. I count among my early companions a beagle, warm fur, calloused scaliness of nose and paws. In the ragged leaving of her breathing, I discover the strength and eagerness of the desiring body I do not know, a child of 10 or 12, I almost have. Badly, painfully, I go on, I learn. Things happen to me in my ignorance, and I learn to love them. Iris breaking the earth in early spring, giving to blue a shape it barely keeps. Or a shattered leaf at red year's end, exposing itself like the dog's tongue in her thirsty mouth after a run in the woods with that tomboy child I was. I walked in woods with you last spring, grateful, telling myself, this I choose exactly as it is. This life of ours keeps bruising us, brings birth and death together, breaks us apart to heal us again and again, whether in love or childbirth, and even when lying alone, we forget what the earth is. I will remember, I promise you, all I've had of love, and give it back, that astonishing fruit of helplessness, anger, and sorrow, willingly, whenever I must, into the mill that made me. And this is Hilde also facing the mill with my shadow. I walk with my shadow, my only companion, alone with it, over grassless meadows. I ever paler, it ever longer. It leads me. I let myself be led. The bare birches along the way, smooth white fingers, know the destination better than I do. When the narrow white roads of the south where you've walked open to you like buds full of sunlight and invite you in. When the world just peeled open calls to you to come outside and sends a unicorn saddled to your door. That is when you should kneel down like a child at the foot of your bed and pray to want little. The time when everything invites you in is the hour when everything abandons you. April. The world smells sweet like yesterday. Aromas linger. You open the window. Every springtime enters the room with this one. Spring that is more than green leaves. One kiss holds all kisses. Always above the city, this shining cloudless sky that the roads run toward. You know, winter and pain are not fatal. The air smells sweet of yesterday, which smelled sweet of today. Tender night. The night will come when you love not what is beautiful, what is plain, not what rises, what must fall, not where you can help, where you are helpless. A tender night, the night when you love what love cannot save. This is the unique case of Hilde's writing a poem to another poet, reading Pablo Neruda. I dance, you stride forward, I fly, you are a river god. The great current of your words, water and land, mine the breath that causes a leaf to tremble. Your simple, honest words, like my simple words, smell of humanity. In a meadow the size of a fingernail sleeps the great change maker, whose hands reach through the world as through water, who is able to tip over the balanced pans and fill them with wind, a sail, joyful, a dance step. Rising from sleep, he endows fruit with wings. The rearranger is sleeping in you, in me, the size of a fingernail. Fear not. The rose says, don't be afraid. Today, my petals are very firm. No breeze will strip them from me before your eyes. The tree inspires confidence and wants me to lean on it. It assures me it is not about to be cut down. The bird's egg in the fork of the tree keeps a promise of small white stability. It waits quietly in the wind for timid eyes in the yolk to dress themselves in feathers and fly onto the branch, singing. I'd like to conclude with a kind of collaboration between Hilde and me, and with gratitude toward James for permitting us to throw in our own work in honor of hers. Shortly after her death, I wrote a poem in memory of Hilde Domin as I had known her. In imagining her as I'd never known her, as a little girl on a swing. I had in mind her own description of her dreaming self in the title poem of her first published book, Only a Rose to Lean On. I build myself a room in air among the acrobats and birds. To have been a refugee was a core identity for her. She set as epigraph for her earliest poems a few words by the Spanish poet and playwright Lope de Vega. Dando voy pasos perdidos por la tierra que toda es aire, which became, in her German, verlorene Schritte tu ich auf Erden, denn alles ist Luft. And my English, my footsteps on earth are lost, for all is air. She carried the idea further in the epigraph to her first book. Ich setzte den Fuß in die Luft und sie trug. I set foot in the air and it held. Here then is my poem in memory of an artist to whom I look up. In Memoriam, Hilde Domin. Poems, small miracles, each one shaping words on the page like a blessing, each one a clear idea. I wanted to know you. On 3 continents, in 5 languages, you worked for long years, exiled. A room of books that wasn't full of books, but of talk and photographs and flowers and friends coming and going, and love and loving rage against injustice was home before you ever could come home. The house to which you came was built into the north slope of a mountain and overlooked the river, the old town. It let in warm sunlight, but stood in a cold shadow. In a stately park among huge trees, you walked and rested on late autumn afternoons. I do not think I could grow old so well. Now that your heart is quiet, who are you? Maybe one we never really knew. A girl, so small, wide-eyed, in a white ruffled dress, the light pouring over you through slender trees in a city no longer there, as you swing out, ever higher, looking up.
Thank you, Sarah. Exquisitely beautiful. The title of Mark Burrows' superb translation, The Wandering Radiance, very beautifully illuminates the predicament and the triumph of Hilde Domin's transcendent poetry. A Jewish German poet, she fled Nazi Germany with her husband and found safe haven in the Dominican Republic. And then, with great courage, returned to Germany after the war, and always as if following that wandering radiance. No wonder then the wondrous phrase appears in her poem, Between Always and Always. Here's a passage from Mark Burrows' rendition. But the wandering radiance, the large, slow hand that unrelentingly caressing strokes you above the eternal heart, doesn't pause, and pushes the hours away on the clock face of your shoreline. with her index finger made of shadow and gold. I love the way that the use of strokes acts as both the caressing of the eternal heart, as well as the strokes of time on the, quote, clock face of the shoreline. The shoreline, like a timeline, the place of departure, and the index finger, quote, made of shadow and gold, end quote, pointing the way, like the fleeing Israelites in Exodus, following the wandering radiance of the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. Mark Burrows, a distinguished translator of the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart and of Rilke's Prayers of a Young Poet, is well positioned to guide us along the sacred poetry path of the Wandering Radiance.
Thank you so much, George, for such a kind and generous welcome introduction. And James, thank you for hosting this event again. It's always a miracle to come back to Cambridge, where we lived for many years, and find the Grolier thriving. I know you all agree with me. It's a miracle that this store exists. I think I discovered Hilde Domin at a time in my life, which is like that, I think, for many of us, when I needed her the most. And discovered in her resilience as a human being, not simply as a poet, but as a human being, a story that encouraged me through some very difficult stations in my own journey. And what struck me from the outset is that this is a woman who never gave up on hope. When everyone around her had become cynical or angry or bitter or resigned, she kept believing. Born in 1909, she grew up, as George mentioned, in Germany, in a well-to-do bourgeois, bürgerliche Familie, she called it, a bourgeois family in Cologne, which in her childhood and younger years had a thriving Jewish, self-confident Jewish community. When she returned in the early mid-1950s, there was almost nothing left. Certainly no Jewish residents survived. Her house alone on the street she had lived on survived the bombing. Everything around on the other side was a pile of rubble. And when she describes going back into that home, ringing the familiar bell with another name now on the door, and entering the house, and going into the living room with this wrought iron Jugendstil fireplace, she collapsed in anguish and tears as the flood of all that had gone became so painfully aware. Some would be bitter by an experience like that, and others would seize it as a moment to create something new. And that was her story, of the ashes of defeat, not just of her own life, but of her people. She created a life, a new life. She, as George mentioned, with her husband, escaped Germany before the worst came, as did her parents and her brother. She and her, at the time, friend, later fiance and husband, left in 1932 after they had read Mein Kampf in a student group in Berlin, where she was living at the time and studying. And then they heard Hitler give a rousing speech on the Hasenwiede, and they realized that this man was going to do everything he promised. And so they managed as students to journey to Italy, where they survived until the race laws of Mussolini enacted in 1938, when they had to flee Italy as well. And that sense of fleeing terror is something that so many in our world know about. And perhaps some of you have that story in your history. It's certainly in my German family. who escaped in an earlier era. She discovered her vocation as a poet in the middle of her life when she was 42 years old. Her mother died. Her father had died a decade earlier. And she wrote about that experience. I, H.D. Hilde Domin, am surprisingly young. I first came into the world in 1951. Actually, when she published her first book in 1959, she fudged on her age and said that she was actually born in 1912 because she thought you can't publish your first book of poems after the age of 50. She went on to say, like everyone else, I came weeping into this world. It was not in Germany, though German is my mother tongue. There, Spanish was spoken, and the garden in front of our house was lined with coconut palms, the family name of her husband, Palm. More precisely, 11 palm trees, all of them masculine, meaning they bore no fruit. My parents were dead when I entered the world. My mother had died only a few weeks before my birth. A different birth. Mother, your death is our second birth. More naked, more helpless than the first. Because you aren't here and don't take us in your arms to console us from ourselves. George already read one of the stanzas from the poem Zwischen immer und immer, between always and always, a marvelous line, a poem all by itself, just the title, between always and always. I'd like to read the whole poem. You've warmed us up for it so beautifully. Shining, soft surfaces of the heart, stillness stretched out between always and always, between morning and evening, from cove to cove. The boat with a white sail makes no incision in the blue of your milk. The gull's quicker white that carries breath with it in wide loops leaves no trace behind. But the wandering radiance, the large, slow hand that unrelentingly caressing strokes you above the eternal heart, doesn't pause and pushes the hours away on the clock face of your shoreline. With her index finger made of shadow and gold, she signals the birds to keep silent in the wide palm basket of the night and redeems the gift of this day from the tender, short blossom holiday of the gentle mimosas. Sarah and I had the great gift and surprise of, actually, the first surprise was that our books appeared on the same day, April 5th, 2023. Neither of us knew that the other was working on Hilde Domin. I'd been translating her work for a decade, more than a decade, and you knew her and worked with her and had been working on this translation for some years. And another woman, Deborah Longstaff, there she is, was also translating her poems and setting them to music. And we had the rare delight and privilege this afternoon at Brandeis University to the three of us present Hilde Domin, co-sponsored by the Goethe Institute. And Deborah sang, among other songs, one that she was asked to sing at Hilde Domin's funeral, which was almost a kind of state affair in Heidelberg in 2006. So Deborah, thank you for that wonderful day. And I'd like to return to a poem you sang. It's called The Hardest Ways or Paths. The German word is ambiguous, and part of the joy and the challenge of any translator working in any language is to try to replicate the ambiguities the deliberate or accidental ambiguities that language brings. Try to create the space where we can wander into the surprise of an image, a metaphor, a line, and be surprised by it or offer it as a surprise to those in another language. That's the consummate, the dazzlingly difficult experience of translating between any languages. Well, this one, The Hardest Ways, she dedicated to, well, the man who published her first book. And in fact, the press that published all of her books, at least in the first editions. And it came at a time when they had returned, she and her husband, to Europe, first to Germany, and then they eventually went to Spain. Well, he was an expert, a scholar of Iberian art and architecture and culture. And they had a not uncomplicated marriage, let's just put it that way. Remained faithful to the end to each other through difficult times. And in that very difficult season of returning, she fell in love with a man who became her publisher, and had a very strong experience of discovering someone who saw her gift as a writer, which her husband for many years refused to allow. That he was a poet, he was a translator, he was a scholar, and she was to have nothing to do with this. So it was a hard way. And here's the poem, The Hardest Ways. The hardest ways are walked alone, disappointment, loss, sacrifice are lonely. Even the dead who answers every call and refuses no request doesn't stand with us and watches to see if we can handle it. The hands of the living that stretch out without reaching us are like the branches of trees in winter. The birds all keep silent. One hears only one's own footstep, and the step one's foot has not yet walked, but will. Remaining where we are and turning around doesn't help. It's necessary to go. Take a candle in hand as in the catacombs. The little light scarcely breathes. And yet, after going a long way, the miracle won't fail to appear, because the miracle is always happening, and because we cannot live without grace. The candle brightens with the day's unencumbered breath. You blow it out laughing as you walk in the sun, and beneath the blooming garden, the city lies before you, and in your house where the table is bedecked with a white cloth for you. And the living ones who can yet be lost, and the unlosable dead break bread and serve wine. And again, you hear their voices very close to your heart. And a remarkable poem. And just as you chose that stanza, it was the central theme woven through your beautiful rendition of this song, of this poem as a song, Deborah. I thank you for that. And it's that line, and yet after going a long way, which she knew and her husband knew together, the miracle won't fail to appear, because the miracle is always happening, and because we cannot live without grace. It's just a stunning moment, a kind of credo, I think, of hers, that in spite of everything that was disappointing, everything that she had lost or feared to lose, there was this miracle, the Wandering Radiance. It was always there if one had eyes to see. She was not only a well-known and celebrated poet, she was an essayist and wrote in newspapers defending causes of justice in very difficult times. She was a champion of poetry in an era of revolution, the late 1960s. when many, if not most, who were fervently demanding change thought that art was simply a diversion, a luxury for the privileged, and not something that could bring a society forward. And she resisted that and refused it and wrote a marvelous book published first in 1968 called What's the Use of Poetry? Wozu Lyrik? Why poetry? A good question to ask in any age when the world is burning up with injustice, with violence, with rage. And in that collection, among other things that she wrote, she had this to say: poetry is like a great pealing of bells, so that everyone takes notice, so that each one who does so listens for that which serves no purpose and would be falsified through compromise. And this holds for the most despairing of poems. And even for a poem that is negative and maddening, it is a pealing of bells. In truth, there is no poem against that is not at the same time, and to a greater extent, for, as an appeal for helpers in order to overcome together something unlivable. And therein lies the catharsis, in an ultimate faith in humanity, without which there could be no poetry. What a stunning line, and a line apposite for these times as well. And therein lies the catharsis, in an ultimate faith in humanity, without which there could be no poetry. One of her shortest poems, and one of my favorites, which she simply entitled Lyrik, poetry, goes like this: Das Nichtwort ausgespannt zwischen Wort und Wort. 4 lines separated with spacing between the first and second lines, and the third and fourth. Poetry, the not word stretched out between word and word. There's no better description of what a poem is, what poetry does for us. Because a poem isn't just about what we say, it's about all of the echoes of the words that we use, the shaping of images, the power of metaphor, right? The way we lure people, readers, the way we find ourselves first lured and then offer that lure to others. Trusting that, in a sense, the poem once written, once published, doesn't belong to the writer anymore, but belongs to the reader. And she had that trust that her poems weren't didactic, never, and they were rarely specific. She prided herself in that there should be what she called an unspecific exactitude, that the descriptions of things should be very clear, but don't tell your own story in the poems. It should be a story that others can inhabit for themselves in the way they need to find themselves in the poem. Remarkable. Bittersweet almond tree. The branches must lose their blossoms so that the trees can green. The pink and the white of the sweet and bitter almond mingle on the ground below. Was the sweet grafted into the bitter, or the bitter into the sweet? All the blossoms are full of honey, light butterfly cradles, all blossoming is sweet. But when the foliage first joins the doubled crown under the bluest skies, in the softest wind, that's when the bitter becomes bitter. James invited us to read a few of our own, and I'd like to do half of that. I'd like to read a translation of a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke. It's from a new book coming out this summer, a new translation of the Sonnets to Orpheus. If you know those poems, one of the most remarkable lines is in the middle of a poem where he invites us to dance the orange, which is a ridiculous thing to say to anyone, but what a marvelous poem. These poems were written, 55 of them, in 10 days over a 3-week period. They came unexpectedly. He wasn't planning them. They simply came to him. He said he heard them coming into his ears, and he could hardly with his pencil keep up with the writing. The first 26 in 3 days. And then he finished 3 of the great elegies in the following 10 days. And then over the 7 days that followed that, 29 more came in a torrent of poetry that really reshaped modernist literature in Europe, not just in German, but I would say in Europe. And here's the last one, which is so close to that feeling that one senses in Hilde Domin's poems. And as Rilke would remind us, poems are not feelings, they're actually experiences. We have feelings, he said, early enough, but a poem is an experience for the poet first, but for each one of us as we encounter, as we inhabit a poem that comes to us. The final poem of the Sonnets to Orpheus. Quiet friend of the many distances, feel how your breath expands the room. Let yourself ring out among the rafters of dark belfries. That which depletes you will become a strength through this nourishing. Go out and in again in transformation. What's your deepest experience of suffering? If drinking is bitter for you, become wine. Be in this night of excess a magic power at the crossroad of your senses, the meaning of their strange encounter. And if the earthly has forgotten you, say to the quiet earth, I flow. To the rushing waters speak, I am. That which depletes you will become a strength through this nourishing. Go in, out, and in again in transformation. And although she didn't write about transformation, her poems, in a sense, model that. They mirror that for us in so many ways. One of them, which seemed, as so many do, far ahead of her time, was called On Punctuation. Doesn't sound like a very promising title of a poem, does it? And the irony of this is that after her first book, there was no punctuation in her poems. It disappears completely, right? Sometimes a final period, but almost nothing in the middle. And sometimes she'll signal that a new sentence or line is beginning by capitalizing the article, which otherwise you wouldn't do in German, unless it's the first word in a sentence. But when she begins a line with a noun, of course, in German, all of them are capitalized. You don't know. Is it in the middle of a line? Is it the beginning of a new sentence? Where are we? And that sense of disorientation is something I felt and feel when I read her. How do you instill that? How do you bring that across to a reader in a language like ours, which doesn't have these subtle little helps or guides? Anyway, On Punctuation, a poem about race. Because blacks fear, because whites fear, my words fear. Because blacks fear, because whites fear, my words fear. A simple comma trapped between punctuation marks, open windows, open lines. My words are afraid of the betrayal by one person of another. Don't tempt him. Leave all the doors open. Don't press us clouds. Presse uns nicht, uns Wolken. These are strange poems, and there's nothing straightforward about them on some levels, because she is taking us into depths of experience through the way she uses German that startle, that surprise, that confuse, all of those things, and that delight. All of those things sometimes at the same time. I'm sure when you were translating, Sarah and Deborah, you probably often felt that too. the sense of discovering something and then it's gone. It slips away and it's gone. And it's an amazing experience. Well, she was writing not political poems, although, as you mentioned, she's a very political person. And her poems have a political edge to them. And in the first collection of poems I published some years ago, I dedicated it actually to a group I started when my first speaking tour in Australia 20 years ago, talking about poetry in a culture that doesn't have a lot of room for poetry, Australian culture. People were sort of baffled and amazed that somebody, an American, would come and talk about poetry, and they loved it. They loved the poems. It was an amazing experience. And a writing group started called the Poets' Corner in a city called Adelaide, which is still going to this day. They meet every month. They've never existed before. It's young, it's old, it's indigenous, it's white, all kinds of people gathering around poems. And they asked me if I would write something for the first collection they published. And I entitled the poem Beyond the Maps. Okay.
Enough, sorry.
That's all right. I like the music. We could move with it a little bit, Jane. Beyond the Maps. Again, we find ourselves gathered by poems, by language shaped in the wide and spacious silences beyond our naming. A handful of words thrown under the canvas of the old certainties, ambitions of war, and other efficiencies of state, and the politics of greed that drive the brokers of this world. And we, sheltering under tents of metaphor and desire, refuse the seduction of their strategies, setting out on paths whose ends we cannot see, steering our way home beyond the maps they've given us, gathering crumbs that will be enough for a feast. So the collection, which came out as I was working on this translation of Hilde Domin, I eventually entitled The Chance of Home. And for me, that image of home, it was so important to her. And it was a complicated word because the word Heimat, homeland or home, was one that the Nazis had taken as their own. And it was almost impossible to use the word. And of course, perhaps it was only somebody who'd been exiled from her homeland, from her home, who could dare to come back and to use that word again and to write about it and to envision what it would be like to find, as she put it, a home in language, to find a home in language. A few more. She wrote a poem called Appeal. This one was noted with a pushcart nomination. And it's a poem that my publisher loved. And I didn't quite understand why, because I feel that way about so many of her poems, but he singled it out. And he felt that it was a poem that captures something so essential for these times. Appeal. Don't go as one burning out. Don't go as one burning out. Don't go as one burning out into the extinction. Now, let me just pause. This is not a lesson in German, but you have to hear it in German. Geh nicht als ein Erlöschender. Geh nicht als ein Erlöschender. Geh nicht als ein Erlöschender in das Erlöschen. You hear the sound. The three lines, erlöschend, one who's burning out into the extinction or the burning outness. Burn, she goes on, burn. We are torches, my brother. We are stars. We are something burning, something rising, or we've not been at all. A body like ours, it's only the sheathing of the balloon, penetrable by light. . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . 。 . . . . . . . . . 。 . . . . . . . . . the last poem. And it was a poem that Hilde Domin read it at every reading as a final poem. It was one of the first poems that really just gripped me when I first encountered it. And just a very brief word about the poem, because actually reading it at Brandeis this afternoon, there was some confusion about a woman who'd sort of come in the middle of the poem and was quite agitated by the poem, what she heard of it. So let me say to you, and nobody's going to walk in, so they won't miss this. This is Hilde Domin was, she said she was part of a community of faith as a Jew. She wasn't a believing Jew. She didn't identify as Jewish through faith or through communal liturgies or prayer or even festivals. She grew up in a secular family, but she was identified as Jewish, and she was not ashamed of that, although she longed to be like some of her Jewish colleagues, those who could believe in the tradition. She often used Christian language and wrote poems about Christian things, a powerful poem called The Saints, which has one of the most remarkable lines. We eat the bread, but live from radiance. We eat the bread, but live from radiance. Wir essen das Brot, aber leben vom Glanz. So that's part of her, and it's a story about grace. But this one is what I would read as a midrash on a familiar story to, I'm sure, all of you, the fratricide of Cain and Abel. And as the rabbis learned to do in those early centuries and through the Middle Ages, when they had a biblical text, they didn't try to find out what it meant. They tried to find out what it might mean, what it might, how you might revoice it, how you might enter it and do something different in the poem, how you might imagine your way into a character who's not even there, but must have been there. All kinds of incredible things. I'm a medievalist by training, so a lot of my time was spent on exegesis, monastic exegesis in the Middle Ages, which is very imaginative. They got that from the rabbis or shared that with the rabbis. What the rabbis did was to write new stories out of the texts, because the stories were still alive for them. They were still living. And this is what Hilde Domin does with the story of Cain killing Abel. It's called, and it's just the poem she ended every reading with in the last 30 years of her life. Abel, get up. Steh auf. Abel, steh auf. Get up, stand up. Abel, get up. It must be enacted again. Every day it must be enacted anew. Every day the answer must still be before us. The answer, yes, must be possible. If you don't get up, Abel, how should the answer, this answer which is the only important one, ever change? We could close all the churches and do away with all the law books in all the languages of the earth. If you would only get up and reverse this, the first wrong answer to the only question that matters. Get up. So that Cain can say, I am your keeper, brother. How could I not be your keeper? Get up every day so that we have this before us, this, yes, I am here, I, your brother, so that Abel's children won't be afraid any longer, because Cain won't be Cain. I write this, I, a child of Abel, and I fear the answer every day. The air in my lungs diminishes as I wait for the answer. Abel, get up, so that it can begin differently between us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for attending the reading this evening. Let's give the two readers, Sarah and Mark, a round of applause. We have some books for sale. They'll be signing books. If everyone could please move your chairs up against one of the walls, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, James.
Thank you so much.
I love you.
Excellent. So can I add the paper to the archives? Okay, great. Perfect. Thanks. Right here. Well, I think it's so awesome.